The smell hit her first. Not the rain, not the grease on her apron, or the cold steam rising off the restaurant's exhaust vent behind her. Something older. Something copper and wrong. The kind of smell that doesn't belong in a back alley at 2 a.m., even in a city that never truly sleeps. Juliet stopped mid-step, trash bag still swinging from her right hand. The neon from the Pojang matcha cart 2 blocks over bled red and pink across the wet pavement. Seoul's alleyways have a language of their own. She'd learned that in 18 months of navigating them on foot, carrying orders, memorizing shortcuts, surviving. This alley behind Mapogu's 24-hour gukbap strip was her alley. She knew which drain backed up when it rained. She knew which rusted door belonged to the seamstress who left her light on until 4. She knew the sound of this block, and right now it sounded like death preparing to clock in. She pressed her back against the wet brick wall and looked. 15 men. Dark suits, the kind of clean, pressed, expensive darkness that doesn't belong in an alley at this hour. The kind of suits that means someone is about to disappear quietly and professionally. They stood in a half-moon formation, the way people who've done this before always stand. No wasted space, no wasted motion, no exits left open. Every one of them carried the stillness of men who had already decided how this night would end. In the center of that half-moon, on his knees in a puddle that reflected the whole ugly city back at him, was a man in a ruined $5,000 suit. His name was Cho Yang-yoon. Juliet didn't know that yet. What she knew was that his jacket was torn open at the shoulder, that there was blood tracking down the side of his face from somewhere above his hairline, dark and slow, the kind of bleeding that means the body is already running out of urgency, that his jaw was set like iron even though he was kneeling, that he hadn't begged, that his eyes, even now, were scanning, calculating, measuring the distance between himself and the nearest exit like a man who wasn't finished yet. The lead assassin crouched down in front of him, pressed the silencer against his forehead with the casual confidence of someone signing a document. The other 14 didn't even tense. They just waited. Juliet's fingers tightened around the trash bag. She was 29 years old, originally from Atlanta. Currently a ghost, no lease, no address, no record of existing anywhere in this city, except the worn vinyl floor of a gukbap restaurant where she worked double shifts and slept in the storage room behind a shelf of industrial-sized soy sauce containers. She had 43,001 folded inside her left shoe. Her entire world, crammed between the insole and the lining next to something a dying man had pressed into her palm 7 days ago and told her to keep safe. She was exhausted. Her feet ached in the particular bone-deep way that only comes from standing 10 hours on restaurant tile. She had soup under her fingernails. Her bun was coming loose on one side. She was, by every measure this city used, invisible. Nobody looks at the waitress. Nobody tracks the woman taking out the trash at 2 a.m. in a stained yellow uniform. Nobody counts her. Nobody worries about her. 15 professional killers had set up an execution 12 feet from a restaurant back door and hadn't once glanced in her direction because people like her, tired, black, working foreign, simply did not register as a threat. That was their mistake. Juliet set the trash bag down. Slowly, quietly. She looked at the lead assassin's wrist, the angle of it, the way his grip tightened as his finger found the trigger. She looked at the puddle on the ground and the distance between her and the nearest crate. She looked at the exhaust vent above her, still pumping hot steam into the cold Seoul air, and she calculated, the same way she calculated whether a table of 8 could be cleared and reset in 4 minutes during a Saturday rush. Then she reached down, pulled off her right work shoe, heavy, rubber-soled, slip-resistant, the kind of shoe built to survive a kitchen floor, and held it in her hand. She'd carried heavier. She'd thrown further. Every tray she'd ever balanced across a packed dining room had been a lesson in aim. Nobody else gets hurt tonight, she told herself. Not on my watch, not in my alley. She exhaled once, pulled her arm back, and threw. Thwack! The shoe connected with the lead assassin's wrist like a verdict. The silenced pistol spun out of his grip and skittered across the wet pavement. 14 heads snapped toward her. Yang-eun's eyes, sharp, electric, suddenly alive, found hers through the rain and the red neon. Juliet stepped forward, out of the shadow, one shoe on and one shoe off, chin raised, voice low and absolutely certain. Kitchen's closed, boys. She held up the only other thing she had, the trash bag, heavy with kitchen scraps, swinging slow like a warning. Get out of my alley. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the nearest assassin started to smile. The lazy, contemptuous smile of a man who has never once had to recalibrate his assumptions about a woman carrying garbage. Juliet was already moving. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below. Where are you watching from? I would love to say hello to you and find out just how far our story is reaching. Every comment lets me know you're here, and trust me, you do not want to miss what Juliet does next. The trash bag connected with the nearest assassin's knee before he even finished his smile. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of move anyone would slow down and replay or admire. It was heavy, wet kitchen weight, potato peels and soup bones, and 3 hours of a restaurant's worth of discarded things, swung low and hard by a woman who had been carrying heavy things her entire life. The man buckled sideways. The man beside him stepped back on instinct, and that half second of confusion, that tiny crack in the formation, was all Juliet needed. She grabbed Yang Yun by the collar of his ruined suit. He was heavier than she expected. Most people were. Every new table she'd ever seated had underestimated how much physical strength it took to do what she did every single day. To carry, to lift, to push, to stand, to move through a room without stopping. Yang Yun was broad-shouldered and solid, even on his knees, even with blood running down the side of his face. But Juliet had pulled 100-kilogram food supply carts up a loading ramp every Tuesday morning for 18 months. She pulled him to his feet in one motion. Move, she said. That was all. No explanation. No introduction. Just the word, delivered the way she delivered orders during a Saturday night rush, clearly, finally, with no room for debate. He moved. She steered him through the back door of the restaurant before the nearest assassin had fully regained his footing. The door was heavy steel, and it closed behind them with a sound like punctuation, a dull, final clang that swallowed the alley and everything in it. Inside, the restaurant was exactly what it always was at 2 a.m. The low hum of the ventilation hood above the stove, the pale glow of the refrigeration units, the faint smell of doenjang and sesame oil that had soaked into the walls so deeply it had become part of the building's bones. The kitchen was empty. The front of house was empty. The single overnight cook, Mr. Park, had stepped out 20 minutes ago to take his break at the Pohang Matcha cart down the block. Juliet knew this because she knew every pattern of every person in this building the same way she knew the menu. By heart, by repetition, by the kind of attention that comes from having nothing else to rely on. She guided Yang Yun past the prep station, past the wall of stacked metal bowls, past the industrial rice cooker, still breathing soft steam into the kitchen air. He was limping. His right hand was pressed against his ribs, not dramatically, not for show, just a quiet, controlled pressure that told her he'd taken at least one solid hit to the midsection before she'd arrived. He hadn't made a sound about it. She noted that. She pulled open the walk-in freezer. The cold came out in a wall, immediate and total, the kind of cold that clears your head whether you want it to or not. Shelves lined 3 sides of it, stacked with labeled containers, frozen stock, vacuum-sealed protein. The smell was clean and sharp. At the very back, behind a shelf unit on wheels, was a gap in the shelving, just wide enough for a person to stand in, that Juliet had discovered on her 3rd week working here when she'd been reorganizing stock and needed somewhere to sit for 4 minutes without anyone asking her to do something. It was her space, one of the few she had. She wheeled the shelf unit out 2 feet, gestured into the gap, and looked at Yang Yun with the flat, efficient expression of someone who does not have time to answer questions right now. He looked at the gap. He looked at her. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The look of a man who had spent his entire life being the one who gave instructions, not the one who received them. But he also had blood drying on his temple and 15 professionals somewhere behind that steel door, so he stepped into the gap without a word. She rolled the shelf back. It didn't lock. It didn't need to. The freezer looked exactly like every walk-in freezer in every restaurant in this district. Orderly, cold, fully stocked. There was nothing in it that would make anyone look twice. She stepped out, pulled the freezer door closed, and stood in the middle of the kitchen. She gave herself 3 seconds, just 3. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and listened to the building. Then she picked up a clean rag from the prep station, walked to the sink, and began wiping down the counter that had already been wiped down an hour ago. They came through the back door 40 seconds later. Two of them, suits dark and damp from the rain, expressions professionally neutral. They didn't crash in. They didn't shout. They moved the way very experienced people move when they are searching a space, methodically, with their eyes doing most of the work. One went left toward the storage shelves. One went right toward the cooking stations. They were looking for disruption, for things out of place, for signs of a hurried passage. Juliet kept wiping the counter. She didn't look up immediately. Looking up immediately was what guilty people did. Innocent people, tired people, working people, people who had been on their feet for 10 hours and had 17 more tasks still on their mental list, looked up slowly, as though being interrupted from a task was mildly annoying. She looked up slowly. "We're closed," she said, in the particular tone she reserved for customers who tried to walk into the dining room after the chairs were already on the tables. Calm, certain, with just enough tiredness in it to be completely believable. The one on the right looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved to the rag in her hand, to her uniform, to the stained apron, to the fact that she was standing at a prep counter in a kitchen at 2 in the morning, doing exactly what a closing shift employee would be doing at 2 in the morning. He looked at the walk-in freezer. His gaze stayed on it for exactly 2 seconds. Juliet did not follow his gaze. She looked back down at the counter and kept wiping. The two men exchanged a look. The one on the left said something low in Korean that Juliet's 18 months in the city had given her just enough vocabulary to partially understand. It translated roughly to, "Nothing here." They left through the back door. Juliet set the rag down. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not, but her hands were, and in her experience, that was the part that mattered. She waited 4 full minutes. She counted them against the rhythm of the ventilation hood. Before she opened the freezer, Yang-eun came out the way he'd gone in, controlled, upright, saying nothing. He had used the 4 minutes well. His breathing had leveled. His hand had moved away from his ribs. He had apparently decided something about the situation, or about her, because when he looked at her now, the calculation in his eyes had shifted into something that wasn't quite trust, but was at least in that direction. "They'll be back," he said. His voice was low and even, accented English that had clearly been practiced for years in rooms full of international business. "I know," Juliet said. She was already moving. She went to her apron, hanging on the hook behind the staff door where she left it every shift, and pulled it free. The apron was more useful than it looked. She had learned early that a waitress's apron was essentially a portable emergency kit, if you were the kind of person who thought ahead. In the deep front pocket, a small sewing kit with a curved needle and black thread. 2 bandages she always kept because the kitchen was full of sharp edges. A folded city transit map she'd acquired in her first month and never thrown away, and a stub of pencil she used for writing down orders when the electronic system went down. She put the apron back on over her uniform. "Come with me," she said. She led him out through the staff door, not the back door the assassins had used, but the interior staff door that opened into the building's utility corridor. It was narrow and unlit and smelled like mop water, and it connected, if you knew where to turn and how far to walk, to the side stairwell of the adjoining building, which led out onto a perpendicular street, entirely invisible from the alley they'd started in. She knew this because she had walked this exact route every night for 6 weeks when she'd been trying to avoid a landlord she owed money to, before she'd finally given up the pretense of having an apartment and moved her 2 bags into the restaurant's storage room for good. She didn't tell Yang-eun any of that. She just walked, and he followed. The side street was quiet. The rain had softened from a downpour to a mist that blurred the neon signs into smeared watercolors. Pink, blue, amber, and made the pavement gleam like the inside of an abalone shell. 2 blocks north, a convenience store's fluorescent lights hummed. 3 blocks east, a PC Bang was still lit up, its windows fogged from the inside. Juliet turned south. "Where are we going?" Yang-eun asked. "Safe place," she said. "You know a safe place." "I know this whole city," she said, without pride and without apology, just as a fact. "Every exit, every shortcut, every place that stays open, and every place that looks open but doesn't actually want you." She glanced at him sideways. "You've been to my restaurant. It wasn't a question. Something in his face shifted. "The corner booth," she said. "Green tea. No sugar. Soft-boiled egg on the side. You always left the egg." She paused. "You also always left 4001 on a 6001 order." A very long beat of silence. "You were the waitress," he said. "Every Tuesday and Thursday for 4 months," she confirmed. "You sat with different people every time, sometimes one man, sometimes 3. Once, you came with a woman in a gray coat who ordered nothing and left before you did." She let that sit for a moment. "I remember every order, every face, every conversation I was close enough to overhear while I was refilling water glasses." Young Yoon said nothing. She could feel him recalibrating. "The man who sends those suits," she said, nodding back in the direction they'd come from. "He comes in too, Wednesday mornings, before the lunch crowd. He orders the premium oxbone broth, and he always complains about the portion size, and he tips exactly 0. She said it flatly, without drama. "I know his voice. I know the 2 men he always sits with. I know that 3 weeks ago he made a phone call from our dining room because his own phone had no signal, and he asked to use the restaurant's landline, and I was standing 8 feet away, clearing the table next to him while he made it." Yang-eun stopped walking. Juliet stopped too and turned to look at him. "You knew," he said slowly. "Before tonight, you already knew who?" "I didn't know what it all meant," she said carefully. "I just knew what I heard. I've been hearing things for months. That's what happens when nobody sees you." She turned and kept walking. "Come on, we need to be off this street." The safe place was not glamorous. It was a storage unit on the 4th floor of a self-storage building near Mapo Bridge. Rented under a name that wasn't hers, paid 6 months in advance in cash, containing exactly 2 folding chairs, a battery-powered lantern, 3 blankets, a change of clothes she'd never needed yet, a box of instant noodle packets, and a small first aid kit that she had assembled slowly and deliberately over the course of 3 months, because she was a woman living alone in a city where she had no emergency contacts and no one who would come looking for her quickly if something went wrong. She had never shown this place to anyone. She had barely let herself think of it as hers, because owning things, even small, temporary, humble things, had a way of making loss hit harder when it came. But she unlocked the unit now and rolled the door up and switched on the lantern and gestured Yang Yoon inside without ceremony, because this was not a night for sentiment. He ducked inside and looked around at the folding chairs and the blankets and the instant noodles stacked in their box, and for just a moment, just one, something moved across his face that wasn't calculation or assessment. It was something quieter than that. Something that recognized the specific, painstaking effort of a person building a small, safe corner in a world that kept trying to take corners away. He sat in one of the folding chairs without being asked. Juliet pulled the other one close, sat down, and opened the first aid kit on her lap. Then she reached into her apron pocket and took out the small sewing kit, the curved needle, the black thread, and set it beside the first aid kit on the floor. "Take off the jacket," she said. He looked at the curved needle. "You're going to stitch me up." "The cut above your ear needs it," she said. "The one on your forearm might. The ribs I can't do anything about except tape them." She met his eyes. "I've stitched a kitchen cut on my own hand in a restaurant bathroom before a shift. Twice. My hands don't shake." She held them up, flat and open so he could see. Perfectly steady. "Take off the jacket." He took off the jacket. Underneath, his white dress shirt was dark on the left side. Not completely, but enough. She helped him ease the shirt off over his shoulders, careful around the arm, careful around the ribs. She didn't make a sound when she saw the bruising along his left side, already deepening toward purple and black, the color of a city sky before a serious storm. She simply noted it, filed it, and moved on. She cleaned the cut above his ear first, hydrogen peroxide on a folded square of gauze, applied with the steady, matter-of-fact pressure of someone who has learned that hesitation hurts more than confidence. He didn't flinch. She noted that too. The cut was deep enough to need 4 stitches. She threaded the needle under the lantern light, tied her knot, and began. The storage unit was very quiet. Outside, somewhere far below, Seoul moved through its nighttime self. Delivery drivers and taxi horns and the distant percussion of a city that never fully went to sleep. In here, there was only the lantern's warm glow, the soft sound of rain against the building's exterior, and the small, precise movements of Juliet's hands. Yang Yun watched her work, not with suspicion anymore, with something more like the focused attention of a man who was accustomed to evaluating people quickly and had just encountered someone who didn't fit any category he'd built. "You're from America," he said. It wasn't a question. "Atlanta," she said. She tied off the second stitch. "Don't move your head. What brought you to Seoul?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a siren moved through the distance and faded. "A plan that didn't work out," she said finally, and then staying because going back felt worse than staying. He considered that. "And you've been working in that restaurant since?" 18 months, she said. "Move your arm out. The forearm needs cleaning." He extended his arm. She examined the cut, long, not deep, the kind left by something with a blade that had caught him at an angle rather than straight on. She cleaned it, dressed it, taped it closed. Her movements were the same as they'd been from the beginning, efficient, certain, unhurried, in the way that only comes from having made a decision and committed to it fully. "The things you overheard," Yang Yun said, "in the restaurant. How much do you actually know?" Juliet set the tape down and looked at him directly. "I know the name of the man who ordered those 15 people into that alley tonight," she said. "I know the 2 officials he's been meeting with every third Wednesday for the last 3 months. I know that 4 weeks ago, the conversation at that table lasted 40 minutes longer than usual, and when it was done, the man in the gray suit left first, and he left angry." She paused. "And I know that a week ago, a man came into the restaurant at closing time. He wasn't there to eat. He was barely able to walk. He sat in the corner booth, your corner booth. And when I brought him water, he pressed something into my hand under the table and told me to keep it somewhere no one would think to look." She reached down, slowly. She pulled off her left work shoe, the one still on her foot, the one she hadn't thrown, and peeled back the inner sole. Flat against the bottom of the shoe, wrapped in a small square of plastic packaging, was a micro SD card, no bigger than a thumbnail. She held it up between 2 fingers in the lantern light. Yang Yun's expression did not change, but his eyes did. "The man," he said carefully. "What did he look like?" Juliet described him. The words were plain and precise. Height, build, the color of his coat, the way he favored his left leg, the small tattoo visible at the edge of his collar. She described him the way she described every regular customer in her memory, completely, accurately, without embellishment. By the time she finished, Yang Yun had gone very still. "He was one of mine," he said quietly. "Not with grief exactly, or not only with grief, with the particular weight of a man absorbing a piece of information that rearranged everything he thought he knew about the last 7 days. He disappeared. We thought—" He stopped himself. "He found me on purpose," Juliet said. "He knew the restaurant. He knew the corner booth." She looked at Yang Yun steadily. "I think he knew you came there, and I think he chose me specifically because he knew nobody would ever think to search a waitress." The lantern hummed between them. The rain had picked up again outside. She could hear it against the metal roof now, harder and more insistent. "He was right," Yang Yun said at last. "He was," she agreed. She put the micro SD card back under the insole and put the shoe back on. Then she stood, folded the used gauze, closed the first aid kit, and tucked the sewing kit back into her apron pocket. She picked up one of the folded blankets and held it out to him without making a production of the gesture. He took it. "Get some rest," she said. 2 hours, maybe 3 if we're lucky, before they think to expand the search radius. I need to think through the city layout. There are people I can reach in the morning who move through this city the same way I do. People nobody tracks." She sat back in her chair and drew her knees up slightly, settling into the particular posture of someone who has learned to rest without fully lowering her guard. Delivery drivers, street sweepers, night shift workers, people who know every road and every camera and every corner of this city because it's literally their job. Yang Yun looked at her for a long moment. The lantern threw warm light across the sharp lines of his face. The jaw, the scar at his chin that predated tonight, the carefully controlled expression of a man who was extraordinarily accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He said, "Just that. Not a challenge. An honest question." Juliet thought about it. She thought about the man in the corner booth, barely able to breathe, pressing something cold and small into her hand. She thought about the trash bag swinging from her fingers in that alley. She thought about Yang Yun on his knees in the puddle, scanning for exits, refusing to stop thinking even in the last possible moment. Because you weren't ready to quit, she said finally, and I've seen enough people quit. She looked toward the small gap at the bottom of the storage unit door where the faint light of the building corridor crept in. And because whatever's on that card, she said quietly, is apparently worth 15 professionals in the rain, which means it's worth protecting. And right now, I'm the only one protecting it. She folded her arms, leaned her head back. Outside, Seoul breathed and hummed and moved through its night, enormous and indifferent and full of people who would never know that, in a storage unit on the fourth floor of a building near Mapo Bridge, something had quietly shifted, the way a key shifts in a lock just before a door opens. Neither of them slept deeply, but both of them rested. And when morning came, Juliet already knew exactly who she needed to call. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I would genuinely love to say hello to you and find out just how far our story is traveling. Every single comment means you're here. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. The first call came at 6:47 in the morning. Juliet heard it on the small radio she kept in the storage unit, a battered thing the size of a paperback book that she used to listen to late-night Korean language programs when she couldn't sleep. She had tuned it low, more for company than for information. But when the morning news broke through the static with a particular urgency in the anchor's voice, she sat up straight and turned the volume dial with two careful fingers. The Korean came fast, the way broadcast Korean always did, clipped and efficient, and assuming the listener had been awake for hours already. Juliet caught enough of it. Her 18 months in the city had given her functional Korean the way hard experience always gives language, not from a classroom, but from necessity, from listening, from being surrounded by it every single day and needing to understand in order to survive. What the anchor was saying was this. Multiple 24-hour restaurants in the Mapo and Yongsan districts had reported disturbances overnight. Groups of men in dark suits asking questions, demanding staff records, going through back rooms, not police, no badges presented, no warrants, no official language. Just men with flat expressions and very specific questions about a woman, a foreign woman, a black woman who worked nights. Juliet turned the radio off. Across the small storage unit, Young-eun was already awake. He had been awake before she moved. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, the kind that comes from a person who has already been thinking for a while, not the slow stillness of someone surfacing from sleep. He was sitting upright in the folding chair with the blanket across his shoulders and his eyes on her face, waiting to see what she did next. "They know about me," she said. "They knew within the first hour," he said quietly. "Once they found the alley empty, they would have pulled footage from the restaurant's exterior camera. It only takes one frame." She had thought of that. She had thought of it the moment she'd pulled him through the back door, had weighed it against the alternative, which was leaving him in the alley, and had made the only decision she could live with. But thinking of something in advance didn't make it easier to hear out loud. "My coworkers," she said. "Yes." She was already on her feet. She pulled her apron straight, checked the insole of her left shoe out of habit. The plastic-wrapped micro SD card was still there, solid and small beneath her heel, and picked up her transit map from the floor where it had fallen during the night. "There's a woman named Mrs. Cho who runs the restaurant on Tuesday and Wednesday mornings," she said, unfolding the map and tracing a route with her finger without looking up. "She's been kind to me. She lets me stay. She doesn't ask questions I can't answer." Her finger stopped on a point on the map. If those men went into the restaurant asking about me, she would have been the one they talked to. "You want to go back," Young-eun said. "I want to make sure she's safe." She looked up. "And I want to know exactly how much they know. Because the way they search tells me who trained them. And who trained them tells me how much time we actually have." Yang Yoon stood. He had refastened his shirt. She had replaced the buttons that were missing with 4 from her sewing kit the night before. Plain black buttons that didn't match the original silver ones, but held, and he looked, if not entirely put together, at least like a man who had made the decision to be functional. The expensive suit jacket he left folded on the chair. It was too recognizable, too ruined, too much the wrong thing. Juliet pulled a folded gray zip-up sweatshirt from the box in the corner. Her spare, the one she kept here the same way she kept everything here, quietly and just in case, and held it out. He put it on. It was slightly small across the shoulders, but it would do. It turned him from a man who looked like a photograph in a business magazine into a man who looked like someone's older brother heading to a convenience store on a Saturday morning. Ordinary. Forgettable. She had learned that ordinary was the most powerful disguise in a city of 12 million people. "Stay close," she said. "Don't speak unless I say something to you first. And when we walk, walk like you're tired." "I am tired." "Good, use it." They came out of the storage building into a morning that was gray and damp and still carrying the previous night's rain in its air. The streets were beginning to fill, delivery trucks making early rounds, street vendors setting up, school uniforms moving in clusters toward the nearest bus stop. Juliet walked at a pace she had perfected over a year and a half, purposeful enough to not look like someone wandering, slow enough to observe everything around her. She saw the first suit before Yang-eun did. He was standing at the corner, half a block from the restaurant, turned slightly away from the street, in the way that people who are watching something always turn slightly away from the street. As though looking at a phone, as though waiting for someone, as though doing absolutely anything except what they were actually doing. He was watching the restaurant's front entrance. Behind him, on the other side of the block, Juliet could see the edge of a second figure. Same posture, same suit, same careful arrangement of the body into an appearance of casualness that wasn't casual at all. Too visible. Probably more she couldn't see. She redirected without breaking stride, turning them down a parallel alley and approaching the restaurant from the back, the way she always did, the way she had done every single workday for 18 months. She knew this approach the way she knew her own hands, which drain to step over, which overhead cable to duck, where the back door's hinges were stiff and needed to be lifted slightly while turning the handle. She lifted. She turned. The door opened silently. Mrs. Cho was inside. She was a small woman in her 60s, with the particular posture of someone who has run a kitchen for decades, straight-backed, quick-eyed, permanently in motion. She was at the prep station when Juliet came in, and she turned with a speed that said she had been waiting and was wound tight with the waiting. When she saw Juliet, her expression moved through three things in quick succession: relief, fear, and then a firm and quiet anger that had nothing to do with Juliet and everything to do with what had happened in her restaurant. Juliet crossed the kitchen and took both of Mrs. Cho's hands in hers. "Are you hurt?" she asked in Korean, simple and direct. Mrs. Cho shook her head. Then she spoke, quickly and low, and Juliet listened without interrupting. The men had come at 4 a.m, 5 of them. They had gone through the back rooms, through the storage room where Juliet slept, through her 2 bags, through everything she owned, which was not very much. They had taken nothing, but they had looked at everything. They had asked Mrs. Cho for a name, a nationality, a description. They had asked if she knew where Juliet went after shifts. Mrs. Cho had told them she didn't know, which was true. Mrs. Cho had always understood, without it ever being said directly, that there were things about Juliet's life that Juliet was managing quietly on her own. She had never pressed. She had simply left the storage room unlocked and kept the light on in the back corridor, and sometimes left extra food in the kitchen at the end of a shift, where someone who was hungry and too proud to ask could find it without having to receive it as charity. Juliet held her hands for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You need to close early today," she said. "Tell the staff it's a maintenance issue. Get everyone out by noon. Can you do that?" Mrs. Cho looked at her steadily for a long moment. Then she looked past Juliet at Yang-eun, who was standing near the door in his gray sweatshirt, saying nothing. Something moved through Mrs. Cho's expression. Recognition, not of Yang-eun specifically, but of a situation. Of the particular shape of serious trouble. She looked back at Juliet and nodded once. "Thank you," Juliet said. And she meant it in a way that words are almost never large enough to carry. She led Yang-eun back out the way they had come, before anyone in the front of house could see them. But she took something with her on the way out. She had spotted it in the alley beside the back door. A delivery motorcycle, a 125cc model belonging to the daytime delivery driver, currently unchained because he'd parked it himself 20 minutes ago and the lock was hanging loose on the back wheel. She knew the driver. She knew his schedule. He wouldn't need it for another 40 minutes. She looked at Yang Un. He looked at the motorcycle. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Can you hold on?" she replied. She took them east, away from the restaurant district, and toward the older part of the city, where the alleys narrowed to the width of a person with their arms half outstretched, and the buildings leaned toward each other overhead, like people sharing a secret. This was the network of streets that the city's food delivery drivers called the interior. Not on any official map with that name, but known to every driver and vendor and night shift worker by feel, by repetition, by the shared knowledge of people who move through cities at odd hours and need routes that the main roads don't offer. Juliet knew the interior the way she knew the menu, by heart. She had been on the motorcycle for 4 minutes when she saw the car. It was a dark sedan, moving parallel to them on the wider street that ran alongside the alley network. She caught it in glimpses between buildings, through gaps in the walls where the old city hadn't quite closed itself up. It was moving at the same speed she was, adjusting when she adjusted, not close enough to be obvious, close enough to matter. She didn't speed up, not yet. She made 2 more turns, left, then a sharp right, that took them deeper into the interior, away from any street wide enough for a car to follow, into the section of the food alley network where the buildings pressed so close together that the morning sky above them was just a pale ribbon. The car couldn't follow here. But that wasn't the end of it. She knew it wasn't the end, because people who send 15 professionals after one target do not rely on one car. And sure enough, when she came out the other side of the narrow section into a slightly wider delivery corridor that ran behind a row of restaurant supply depots, she heard the second motorcycle before she saw it. 2 of them. Behind her now. Gaining. "Hold on," she said. She meant it seriously. She opened the throttle and took them left through a gap between 2 depot buildings that was technically a loading bay entrance and not a through route, but which Juliet knew from countless early morning supply runs connected to the back service road of the wholesale produce market. The motorcycle bucked over the uneven ground. Yang Yun's hands tightened against the back of the seat frame, not around her, just behind her, holding the frame with the grip of a man who was absolutely committed to staying on this vehicle. The 2 motorcycles behind them made the gap too. She had expected that. What she had also expected was the produce market's morning rush. She came out of the service road entrance into controlled chaos. Flatbed carts loaded with wooden crates, workers in rubber boots moving in every direction, forklifts reversing with high-pitched warning signals, the enormous specific noise of a wholesale market at 7 in the morning doing what wholesale markets do. She didn't slow down. She knew this market. She had walked through it 100 times on her way to source specialty ingredients that the restaurant supplier didn't carry. She knew the main thoroughfare through it, which looked impassable but wasn't. And she took it at a speed that made every worker they passed shout something at them that she was absolutely not going to slow down to fully hear. Behind her, the pursuing motorcycles entered the market and immediately encountered the forklift that was reversing into the exact corridor Juliet had just cleared by half a second. She didn't look back to watch. She heard the shout, the squeal of brakes, the deep resonant sound of a wooden crate full of winter radishes making very close acquaintance with the ground. She came out the far side of the market onto a quiet delivery road and let the throttle ease back to a normal speed. "Are they behind us?" she asked. Yang Yun looked back. "Not yet," he said. "Yet," she noted. She turned north. There was one more thing she needed to do, and she needed to do it in a place where she could stop moving for 15 minutes without being exposed. She knew exactly where that was, a basement loading area beneath a row of commercial buildings near Uljiro that the city's delivery driver network used as an informal rest stop. There would be people there she could trust. There would also be, more importantly, a laptop that belonged to a driver named Seojin, who owed her a favor from a night 6 months ago when she had covered an entire delivery route for him when he was too ill to finish it and too broke to lose the work. She had never called in that favor. She was about to. Seojin was 24 and small and wore the same faded orange jacket every single day and was currently eating a triangle kimbap when Juliet pulled the motorcycle into the basement loading bay and cut the engine. He looked at her. He looked at Yang-eun. He looked at the motorcycle, which he recognized as not hers, and then back at her face, which told him clearly that this was not a morning for extended questions. He handed her the laptop without being asked. "I need 15 minutes, she said. "Take 20, he said, and went back to his kimbap. She sat on an overturned crate with the laptop across her knees. Yang-eun sat beside her. She pulled off her left shoe, removed the insole, and took out the small plastic-wrapped card. Her fingers were steady. They were always steady. She unwrapped it carefully, set the plastic aside, and looked at the card in the loading bay's pale fluorescent light, smaller than her thumbnail, unremarkable, the kind of object you could carry for a week in your shoe, and no one in the world would ever know. She inserted it into the laptop's card reader. It opened without a password. Whoever had prepared it had designed it to be accessed quickly, by whoever it ended up with, without barriers. Which told her something about how that dying man had thought about this. He hadn't been trying to protect the card from the person carrying it. He had been trying to protect it only from the people who would be looking for it. The files loaded. There were 3 of them. One was a spreadsheet. One was a folder of photographs. One was a document of about 40 pages, written in Korean with an English section at the end. Juliet opened the spreadsheet first. Columns. Names on the left, some Korean, some not. Titles beside the names. Ranks, positions, district assignments, police precinct numbers, city council designations. And beside every name in the next column, amounts, dates, and in the final column, a single word or short phrase that she understood, even with her partial Korean, to mean what it meant. Payment. For service rendered. For a case closed. For a report amended. For a person not found. She scrolled down. The list was long. It went back 4 years. She opened the photograph folder. Images of meetings taken from distances, through windows, across restaurant tables. Faces she didn't know beside faces she did. The man who came to the restaurant on Wednesday mornings. The man in the gray suit. Officials whose faces she had seen on the television news mounted above the restaurant counter during slow afternoon hours. Men shaking hands over documents. Men exchanging envelopes. The photographs were dated, time-stamped, some of them annotated in small text at the bottom of the frame. She opened the document last. She read the English section at the end, which was shorter but dense, a summary written in the careful English of someone translating their own thoughts from Korean in real time. It described, methodically and with specific names and dates, a network of payments made to law enforcement officials across 6 of Seoul's administrative districts in exchange for protection. Not protection of ordinary citizens, but protection of operations. Routes, buildings, people. The dying man in the corner booth had not just handed her evidence. He had handed her the entire architecture of how this city's hidden operations had stayed hidden for 4 years. Juliet sat very still for a moment. The spreadsheet was still open on the screen. The numbers ran on and on, line after line of transactions that had kept the 15 assassins in that alley insulated from consequence, that had kept the Wednesday morning man in his corner, eating his soup and complaining about portion sizes with no fear of any record being kept, that had kept Cho Young-eun's enemies powerful enough to move against him openly and be confident that no investigation would survive the morning. She looked at Yang-eun. He had been reading over her shoulder in silence. His expression had been still the entire time. Not blank, but controlled in the specific way of someone receiving information they had partially suspected and are now having confirmed in a form they cannot dismiss or reinterpret. "The traitor," she said, "the person inside your organization who told them where you would be that night." She scrolled back to the spreadsheet and pointed to a name near the top of the list. High up, which meant early, which meant long-standing. He's been on this list for 3 years. Yang-eun looked at the name for a long time. Something shifted in his jaw. Not anger, exactly, or not only anger, the particular expression of a man absorbing a betrayal that reconfigures the meaning of 3 years of trust. "You knew," he said quietly. "You said last night that you already knew who the traitor was before I did." "I heard his name in the restaurant," she said. "In a conversation I was not supposed to be close enough to hear. 3 months ago, a Wednesday morning, the man with no tips was on the phone." She closed the spreadsheet and ejected the card. "I didn't know what it meant, I do now." She wrapped the card back in its plastic and pressed it back under the insole of her shoe. She put the shoe back on and stood up from the crate. Across the loading bay, Seojin had finished his kimbap and was watching them with the calm curiosity of a person who has learned that the most interesting things that happen in this city happen to people who move through it at odd hours. Seojin, Juliet said, I need to ask you something. He tilted his head. How many drivers in the network owe you a favor? She asked. He thought about it for exactly 2 seconds, in the way that someone thinks about something they already know the answer to, but want to make sure they're representing accurately. Enough, he said. Good, she said. Because I need eyes on 6 districts by tonight. I need to know where every dark suit is moving, which corners they're watching, and which buildings they've been and out of since 4 this morning. She looked at him steadily. Nobody gets close to them. Nobody does anything. I just need to know where they are. Sojin looked at Yang-eun one more time. Then he looked back at Juliet, and something in his expression settled into a kind of quiet, uncomplicated resolve that she recognized. The look of someone who has been waiting for a reason to be useful in a way that actually matters. I'll make some calls, he said. Juliet nodded. Outside, the city was fully awake now, loud and layered and enormous and moving in all its millions of directions at once. Somewhere in it, 14 men in dark suits were still searching. Somewhere in it, the Wednesday morning man was probably already aware that his operation had a problem he hadn't anticipated and was making his own calculations about how to correct it. But somewhere in it, too, a network of people who moved through its back roads and pre-dawn corridors and service entrances. People who were invisible because the city had decided they were. People who kept Seoul fed and clean and running without ever appearing in any photograph or newspaper, were beginning, quietly and without drama, to open their eyes. And in a basement loading bay near Uljiro, a woman with a micro SD card in her shoe and a sewing kit in her apron pocket was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you and find out just how far our story is reaching across the world. Every comment tells me you're here, and I promise you, what comes next is worth staying for. By noon, Seojin had made 43 calls. Juliet knew this because she had been sitting in the basement loading bay, listening to every single one of them, tracking names and locations on the back of her transit map with the stub of pencil from her apron pocket. She drew no elaborate diagram. She didn't need to. She simply wrote names in columns, drivers on the left, districts on the right, times in the middle, the same way she wrote down a table's order during a busy shift when the electronic system was down. Clear, fast, organized in a way that only made complete sense to the person who had written it. Seojin moved through his contacts the way experienced people move through a space they know by heart. No wasted motion, no repeated steps. He called drivers who called cleaners, who called parking attendants, who called the women who ran the overnight laundry services behind the hotel district. He called the man who repaired vending machines, and therefore had legitimate reason to be in almost every building in 6 districts. He called the 3 brothers who ran the largest overnight freight operation on the south side of the Han River. None of these people were asked to do anything dangerous. None of them were asked to confront or follow or engage. They were simply asked to look and then to report back to Seonin what they saw. It turned out that people who had spent years being overlooked by a city were exceptionally good at looking back. By 1 in the afternoon, Juliet had a complete picture. The remaining assassins, she counted 14 from the reports, which meant 1 was unaccounted for, which she filed away as something to think about carefully, had spread across 4 districts in a pattern that was methodical and professional. And also, now that she could see the whole shape of it laid out on the back of her transit map, deeply revealing. They weren't just searching, they were positioning. They were moving into locations around the Dongdaemun Design Plaza in a formation that made sense only if you knew that the Global Food Summit was being held there in 36 hours. They weren't just hunting Juliet and Yang Yoon anymore. They were preparing for something that was going to happen at that summit regardless, something the microSD card's contents had already told her enough to understand. The Wednesday morning man and his associates were planning to use the summit as cover for a final consolidation, a meeting of everyone on that spreadsheet, everyone who had taken payments, everyone whose name appeared in those annotated photographs. A gathering disguised as an elegant, catered event where the people who had kept this operation running for 4 years would sit down together in a room full of international dignitaries and finalize an arrangement that would make everything on that card irrelevant, because the people who might act on it would no longer be in any position to do so. She explained all of this to Yang-eun in the loading bay's quiet, spreading the transit map between them on the floor. He listened without interrupting. This was something she had come to appreciate about him in the past 24 hours. He was a man who knew how to listen when the person speaking had information he didn't. A lot of people in positions of power forgot how to do that. He hadn't. The summit's catering is contracted out, she said. High-end service company called Baekwa Hospitality. They supply staff for every major event at the plaza. She had learned this from Seo-jun, who had learned it from a driver who regularly transported linen deliveries for Baekwa's events division. They're short-staffed for the summit. They put out a last-minute call for experienced hospitality workers 2 days ago. Yang-eun looked at her. I have 17 years of combined waitstaff experience across 4 countries, she said. I know how to set a formal table, carry a tray at shoulder height through a crowded room, and read a guest list for a seated dinner. She paused. And you know how a professional kitchen runs. You've been in enough restaurants over the years. As a customer, he said. Then it's time you learned the other side, she said. Baekwa's kitchen intake processes new staff through a holding area behind the plaza's east service entrance. They check credentials, but the system is manual, paper forms, not digital verification. It's a gap. She looked at him steadily. You go in as a dishwasher. Dishwashers don't need certificates. They need to show up on time and move fast. And you, he said. I go in as a senior waitstaff, she said. I've been doing this long enough that I can walk into any service environment and within 4 minutes look like I've always been there. She folded the transit map along its original creases, precise and practiced. I need 2 things from you before we go in. Tell me. I need you to trust that once we're inside, I run the floor, she said. Not you. The moment we step into that building, I am the senior staff, and you are the new dishwasher who doesn't speak much. Whatever I say, you do. Whatever I ask you to carry, you carry it. Whatever door I tell you to go through it without hesitating. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through it. The same internal adjustment she had watched him make in the freezer, and again in the storage unit, and again on the motorcycle. The deliberate, disciplined act of a person setting aside a default position because the situation required something different. Agreed, he said. And the second thing? She reached into her apron pocket and produced the small wireless microphone, no larger than a button, with a transmitter the size of a matchbox. Seo-jun had produced it from a bag in the loading bay with the explanation that it belonged to a driver who did part-time work for a community radio station on weekends. It was simple technology, unglamorous and functional, with a range of approximately 40 meters and a transmitter that could be paired to any device with a standard audio input. The summit's main hall has an integrated audio system, she said. Venue systems like that have a house feed, a secondary input that technicians use during setup. If a transmitter is paired to that input during the pre-event technical check, anything broadcast on that frequency plays through the main hall's speakers. She set the microphone on the floor between them. I know this because I worked a corporate dinner at a venue with the same system 3 years ago, and the audio technicians spent 45 minutes explaining it to me while I was setting tables nearby. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has spent years collecting information simply by being present and paying attention. Nobody notices what the waitress hears. Yang-eun looked at the microphone for a moment. Then he looked at her. You've been building toward this, he said slowly. Not just tonight, the months of listening, the card, the map, even the storage unit. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the specific recognition of a person understanding a situation more completely than they had a moment ago. You didn't know what it was all leading to, but you kept everything, just in case. I've learned, she said simply, that the things nobody thinks are worth keeping are usually the most important ones. She picked up the microphone and put it in her apron pocket. "We go in at 8 tomorrow morning," she said. "The summit dinner is at 7 in the evening. That gives us 11 hours on the inside." The east service entrance of the Dongdaemun Design Plaza at 8:15 in the morning looked exactly the way every service entrance at every major venue looks at 8:15 in the morning. Controlled chaos, slightly behind schedule, and completely dependent on the competence of the people moving through it. Crates were being carried in. Linen was being sorted. A man with a clipboard was simultaneously directing foot traffic and talking into a headset with the expression of someone whose morning had started difficult and was not improving. Juliet walked through the entrance with the specific stride she had developed over years of walking into busy service environments, purposeful, unhurried, carrying her own folder of handwritten notes as though it contained information critical to the successful operation of everything around her. She had borrowed a black service jacket from Seojun's contact in the linen supply chain. It wasn't a perfect fit, but it was pressed and clean and professional. And in a service environment on event day, pressed and clean and professional was indistinguishable from official. She found the Baikwa intake coordinator in under 2 minutes, presented herself as a last-minute senior placement from the agency, handed over a paper form that she and Sojun had spent 90 minutes preparing the previous evening, and was assigned to the main dining service team before the coordinator had finished processing her paperwork. Yang Eun came through 40 minutes later with the kitchen intake group. She didn't look at him when he passed. She was already on the floor of the main hall, moving between tables with a measuring tape she had borrowed from the linen area, checking place settings with the focused attention of someone who had been trusted with the detail work because they were clearly the right person for it. The day moved the way event days move, fast, layered, with 100 small problems being solved per hour by people who were too busy to complain about them. Juliet worked. She set tables. She briefed the junior waitstaff on the service sequence for the evening. She walked the floor manager through the dietary accommodation chart with a fluency that came from having memorized it in 40 minutes during a break. Because memorizing lists was simply what her mind did. And while she worked, she mapped. She mapped every entry and exit point in the main hall. She mapped the positions of the venue's audio technicians during the afternoon sound check. Specifically, the location of the secondary input panel on the north wall behind the stage curtain, which was exactly where she had calculated it would be based on the venue's publicly available technical specifications. She mapped the kitchen corridor layout, the timing of the service elevator runs, the location of every security camera she could identify, and the table assignments for the evening's seated dinner. Specifically, which table in the center of the room had been reserved under a name she recognized from the spreadsheet on the micro SD card. At 4 in the afternoon, during the 45-minute staff break before final setup began, she found Yang Yoon in the kitchen corridor outside the dishwashing station. He was leaning against the wall with the contained stillness she had come to recognize as his version of rest. And when she appeared, he straightened immediately. She showed him the floor plan she had sketched on the back of the dietary accommodation chart. "The main targets will be at this table," she said quietly, pointing. "I count 7 names from the card on tonight's guest list. The rest of the table will be dignitaries who have no connection to any of this. They're cover. The whole arrangement of the evening is designed to look like a legitimate international gathering." She moved her finger to the north wall. "The audio input panel is here. During the dessert service, when every staff member is in motion and the room is at maximum noise level, I'll be close enough to pair the transmitter. Once it's paired, anything within 40 meters of this microphone will play through the main hall sound system." Yang Yoon studied the sketch. "And the assassins?" "Seojun's network tracked 12 of them moving toward the plaza's perimeter through the afternoon," she said. "They're outside the building for now. The venue's own security is handling the official guest screening, which means the suits can't come in through the front. They'll try the service entrance during the dinner service when the in and out traffic is highest and hardest to track." She paused. "Which means they'll come through the kitchen." A beat of silence. "Which is where you'll be," she said. He looked at her. "You know this building's kitchen better than they do," she said. You've had 8 hours in it. You know where the stock is, where the exits are, and where the floor gets slippery near the prep sinks. She held his gaze. I need them contained in the kitchen, not because of what they'll do to us, because if they get to the main hall during the broadcast, they'll shut it down before anyone hears enough to act on it. How many in the kitchen team do you trust? He asked. Seojin's brother is on the freight team covering the loading bay, she said. He's not a fighter, but he knows how to lock a service door and when to call for help. She folded the sketch. I'm not asking anyone to fight. I'm asking the kitchen to work the way a kitchen works under pressure, with heat and noise and every surface being exactly where it needs to be. The rest will take care of itself. He looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said quietly, in my world, we spend a great deal of resources building intelligence networks. Teams of people, technology, resources. He paused. You did it with a pencil and a transit map. And a good memory, she said. Get back to the dishwashing station. Service starts in 2 hours. The dinner began at 7, with the particular formal elegance of events designed to look effortless, which meant that underneath the surface, every person in a service jacket was moving at maximum speed through a very precise sequence. Juliet moved through it the way she moved through every service, completely, attentively, with every part of her awareness operating on 2 levels simultaneously. The visible level, trays, timing, temperature, table etiquette, the exact angle at which a bowl of consommé should be placed before a seated guest. The invisible level, the north wall, the audio panel, the faces at the center table, the timing of the room. The guests at the center table were exactly who the card had said they would be. She had served 3 of them water within the first 20 minutes of service, which meant she had been close enough to confirm their faces against the photographs in the folder on the laptop. She hadn't let her expression change once. She simply refilled the glasses and moved on. At 7:42, during the main course service, when the room was at its fullest, and the noise of 400 conversations created a sound environment that made individual attention to any one point in the room nearly impossible. She carried a silver serving tray along the north wall toward the stage curtain. She set the tray on the edge of the audio panel housing, as though resting it momentarily. Her left hand placed a bowl. Her right hand, below the tray's sightline, found the secondary input port on the panel, inserted the transmitter, and paired it to the microphone in her apron pocket, in a sequence that took 11 seconds and required her to look at her hands exactly once. She picked up the tray and continued along the wall. At 7:51, she was refilling water at the center table when the man she knew from Wednesday mornings leaned toward the official beside him and said something that she was close enough to hear clearly. It was specific. It included a name, an amount, and a date. The date being 3 days from now, the arrangement being the final step in a consolidation that the card had already described in outline, but that she was now hearing confirmed out loud in the man's own voice, with witnesses seated 4 feet away who had no idea they were witnesses. She pressed the small button on the microphone in her apron pocket. The room's sound system carried it perfectly. Every word, clear, amplified, and unmistakable, moved through 412 speakers distributed across the ceiling of the main hall of the Dongdaemun Design Plaza. The conversations at every other table paused in the confused, attentive way that conversations pause when something unexpected enters a room's audio environment. Heads turned. A woman near the front raised her phone. 3 international journalists who had been covering the summit's legitimate proceedings as a professional assignment looked at each other and then reached simultaneously for their recording equipment. The man at the center table stood up. Juliet was already moving away from the table, tray in hand, the same measured pace she had maintained all evening. Behind her, the room began to understand what it had just heard. In the kitchen, she knew something else was happening, because at the same moment, 3 dark suits came through the service entrance in exactly the pattern she had predicted, moving fast and purposeful toward the corridor that led to the main hall. And in that corridor, between them and the hall's service door, they encountered a kitchen in full operation. Hot surfaces, a floor that was genuinely slippery near the prep sinks as the evening's full-service load had accumulated, and a man in a borrowed dishwasher's uniform who was not, as it turned out, a dishwasher. She heard it from the hall. The particular noise of a kitchen that has become something more than a kitchen. The crash and clatter and raised voices that told her the corridor was not going to be an easy passage for anyone trying to move through it quickly. Yang Yun had spent 30 years in situations that required him to use whatever was immediately available, and a professional kitchen at full evening service had an enormous amount immediately available. Hot stock pots, sheet trays, a floor that absolutely punished overconfidence. The remaining suits outside the building, Seojin's network had been watching them, encountered a different problem. Seojin's brother had locked the loading bay's exterior doors at 7:45, and Seojin himself had made a very specific call at 7:46 to a number that the micro SD card's document section had identified as the one clean precinct in the city. The one whose commander's name appeared nowhere on the spreadsheet because he had never taken a single payment and had spent 3 years wondering why every case his division filed seemed to stall before it reached resolution. That commander arrived at the plaza's perimeter at 8:04 with enough personnel to make the exterior position of the remaining assassins a very uncomfortable place to be standing. By 8:22, the main hall was in the controlled disruption of a situation being handled by people who had just been handed through a sound system enough evidence to handle it decisively. By 8:35, the center table had been formally approached by officials who had been in the hall as legitimate summit guests, and who now had both the audio from the broadcast and the physical presence of the Clean Precinct's commander to support what they were doing. Juliet stood at the side wall with her empty tray and watched. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt, more than anything, the specific tiredness of a person who has been operating at maximum intensity for 36 hours and has just watched the last piece of a very complicated sequence fall into its correct place. It was the feeling of a perfect service. Everything on time, everything at the right temperature, every guest attended to, every detail honored. The satisfaction was real. It was also quiet. Young Yoon found her there 20 minutes later. His borrowed dishwasher's jacket was in significantly worse condition than it had been at the start of the evening, but he was upright and steady, and the expression on his face had settled into something she hadn't seen there before, something lighter than everything else he had shown her over the past day and a half. He stood beside her and looked at the room. "The microphone," he said. "When did you decide on that?" "When I found out the venue had the same audio system as a hotel banquet hall in Atlanta I worked in when I was 22, she said. "Sometimes what you know from the past is exactly the tool the present needs." He was quiet for a moment. "Your coworkers, Mrs. Cho." "I'll go back in the morning," she said. "She'll have opened back up. She always opens back up." A pause. "I'll owe her a very thorough explanation." "Among other things," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "The restaurant," he said. "I want to buy it. Not to own it as a business interest. I mean to give it to someone, with a full deed of ownership, completely and legally." He turned to look at her directly. "It should belong to someone who actually understands what that place is, what it means to the people who use it and the people who work in it." Juliet looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to," she began. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I've spent a very long time doing things I had to do. I would like to do something because it's right." A pause. "The restaurant is yours, Juliet, if you want it." She looked back at the room, at the dignitaries and the journalists and the officials moving through the aftermath of an evening that had become something none of them had expected, at the servers still moving professionally through the chaos because the job didn't stop just because the situation had changed. At Seoul visible through the plaza's tall windows, enormous and lit and continuous, the city moving through its night the way it always did. "I don't know anything about running a business," she said. "You ran an entire intelligence network in 36 hours with a pencil and a transit map," he said. "I think you can learn a balance sheet." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "There's something else," he said. "What I've been doing, what my organization has been built around, it needs to change. Not just because of what's on that card, because of what this city actually needs." He paused, choosing his words with the deliberate care of someone making a statement they intend to keep. The Plaza District, the food alleys, the people who work the overnight shifts and the delivery routes and the cleaning services. This city runs on those people. And those people have nothing protecting them. No voice in how any of it is organized, no stake in any of it. He looked at her. I want to change that. Not alone. I need someone who understands those communities the way I never have, someone they already trust. You're asking me to be your partner, she said slowly. Not in anything that belongs to the life I'm leaving behind, he said. In rebuilding, in the parts of this city that are worth rebuilding. Community investment, legal structures, real protection for real people. He paused. You know every alley and every face and every midnight worker in 6 districts. I have resources and reach that could actually make structural change possible. Another pause. Neither of us can do it alone. Juliet was quiet for a long time. She thought about Atlanta and the plan that hadn't worked out. She thought about 18 months of storage room floors and borrowed light and the particular loneliness of being invisible in a city of 12 million people. She thought about Mrs. Cho leaving extra food in the kitchen where someone who needed it could find it without having to ask. She thought about Seojun making 43 calls without asking why. She thought about a dying man in a corner booth who had looked across a restaurant and decided, out of everyone he could have chosen, that the waitress was the one worth trusting. She thought about the fact that she had spent a year and a half in this city being overlooked, and that being overlooked had given her access to every truth the city's powerful people thought they were keeping hidden. She looked at Yang Yun. The restaurant deed comes first, she said. In writing, in my name, before anything else is discussed. Agreed, he said immediately. And Mrs. Cho stays on, she said, with full wages and her schedule exactly as she chooses it. She runs the kitchen. That doesn't change. Agreed. And the delivery drivers and the street cleaners and every person in Seojun's network, she said. Whatever we build, they're part of it. Not as resources, as people with a stake in it. That, he said, is exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Outside, Seoul moved through its night, loud and layered and indifferent to the specific and extraordinary thing that had just happened inside one of its buildings. The food alleys were still running. The overnight workers were still working. The city's invisible infrastructure of tired and capable and overlooked people was still, as it always was, holding everything up. And in the main hall of the Dongdaemun Design Plaza, a woman with a sewing kit in her apron pocket and a transit map in her memory stood at the edge of the room she had just changed and began, quietly and without drama, to think about what came next. She had never been afraid of the next thing. She had only ever been tired. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't tired. She was ready. And that is where our story ends, but not where Juliet's story ends. Subscribe right now so you never miss what we put out next. And drop a comment below telling me exactly where in the world you are watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to every single one of you, because the fact that this story traveled all the way to where you are sitting right now is something that means everything to me. Comment your city, your country, your continent. Let me know how far our story has gone. See you in the next one.